Welcome to my Baldur's Gate 3 combat guide, a video designed to turn you from zero to hero and help you fight through the turn-based strategic combat that is inside of Baldur's Gate 3. Let's jump straight in. Firstly, actions, bonuses, and reactions. We'll start relatively simple and then work our way through. During combat, each character will have an action that they can generally use once per turn. Alongside that, they'll also likely have bonus actions, and these can vary wildly from different items that you could use on yourself, like healing potions, to battlefield effects like a bottle full of grease, to individual character actions, and these could be specialized depending on your class as well. So make sure you take a look and familiarize yourself, though most characters will be able to do things like jumping and shoving on top of their normal attacks and movements. Over on the right, you'll notice their reactions. Specifically, most commonly, it'll be the opportunity attack, which basically lets you strike an enemy that moves within your range as a reaction. So it can happen during their turn. You don't have to manually trigger it yourself. You can always watch out for it by checking for these red swords that look like they're stabbing into the side of your character. That means that an enemy will strike you with an opportunity attack if you try and move outside of their range, so you might need to do something like a cunning action if you're a rogue to disengage. Normal characters can do it as well, though it will take a standard action point instead of a bonus one to quickly run your booty out of trouble. You can also look, of course, to use a variety of spells and items to disengage outside of that as well, to avoid those nasty reactions. And as a final note here for this first tip, I would just say make use of everything. Even if you may or may not need it, like this extra armor here on my wonderful cleric, you should generally try and utilize every single action you've got for every character, because you never know. Give it a go, give it a shove, you might just knock them off the edge and win the fight that way. Melee, ranged, or spellcaster. Let's talk about the three different classes and what they really ought to be doing and not doing. Ranged attackers will almost always be looking to have high dexterity, so it could be a fantastic rogue assassin like me. It's dexterity that directly relates to those ranged attacks, as well as agility and reflexes. Moving through to the more traditional melee class, like a fighter, here it's more about your strength rather than your dexterity. So you'll want to have muscles and strong physical power. There is one exception, by the way, finesse, which I was using on my rogue, that can take advantage of strength or dexterity for those slightly more beautiful melee weapons. And lastly, of course, we have our spellcasters, likely the most complex of the three groups. Instead of dexterity and strength, you're likely looking at intelligence, although it does depend a little bit. If you're not a spellcasting wizard, then instead you'll be looking at wisdom for druids and clerics, or alternatively charisma for bards, paladins, warlocks, so on and so forth. Make sure you also take note of the gear that you're using, because it will have a proficiency as well. It's not just your melee weapon, it's your armor. So for a rogue, for example, I'm looking for some lighter weight gear, not this middleweight or heavyweight item that I'm currently looking at. And it's really important that you lean into your proficiencies and build them up as you develop your class. You'll also, of course, get additional features and actions and all of the things that we've been talking about. A quick note at the end of this section, generally it's not a good idea to split up into multiple classes until at least level 3 or 4, and generally those spellcasters, wizards, can be a bit more complex. Next up, let's talk about actually hitting your target. What does it mean, and how does it work, Jumbo? Well, you'll always see this percentage. In this case, it's very high, and we'll talk about that a bit later in the video, about these different modifiers and how they're impacting it. But at a base level, the percentage is the chance that you will hit. It has nothing to do with damage, it's just the chance that the attack will hit. Here, unfortunately, I missed. I had a 50-50. Here, again, it's a 50-50, and I managed to get the strike. We'll talk a bit about saved rolls later in the video. It's important to note, though, that the percentage chance is completely separate from damage, and you can use different things like lurking in the shadows, or getting high ground advantage over an enemy, using the battlefield terrain to your advantage to try and lift up this figure. It is essentially your attack roll against their armor score, and that, alongside of those other environmental or spell-based factors, will determine whether your attack hits or misses. As an example, you can examine any enemy to check their armor class. The higher the enemy's armor class, the lower the chance that you'll actually hit them. So an enemy with relatively low armor will be ripe for the taking, and then of course I can lean into those other things, like the high ground advantage, like the effective range, which we'll talk about just a little bit later in the video. But it's also important that we understand, okay, so once we hit them, how much damage can we actually strike them for? Hitting tab or I or what have you will open up your inventory, and here you can check your vital statistics, like your armor class, so the chance of you dodging an attack, and your actual damage itself. This of course takes into account the weapon that you're using, and specifically how it's rolled. You can also check other little things that you might have that are helping you out, like an initiative, the assassinate one, for example, I've got here, among many, many others. Now, in terms of the actual strike itself, here I have advantage over a prone enemy. It's an easy strike. And if we open up the combat log, we can see exactly what happened. Firstly, they had an armor class rating of 11. My attack roll, I rolled a d20, had some advantages, was 22. That means that my attack hit. Once it hit, how much damage did it do? Well, this depends on the weapon and my overall extra abilities that are being factored in. So, we've hit them for sure, and we've rolled 1d8 plus some extra damage for my dexterity modifiers and ended up with a 10 damage roll. And here's that weapon. You can see specifically that it rolls a 1d8 and then adds 3 extra piercing damage. And that's how we ended up with our score. A reminder, of course, a d8 is simply an 8-sided die. So it's rolling that and then adding 3. And that's how we ultimately got to our 10 damage, 7 plus 3. This enemy over here has a slightly higher armor class than the first one we destroyed while they were laying down prone on the roof, at 13 instead of 11. And that means that the chance of me hitting them will be a bit lower, 65% in this case. And in this specific instance, my damage will be lower as well. Why? Because I'm using a worse weapon. It doesn't have extra piercing damage, as you can see down the bottom right, and it's only rolling a d4 die, so I can only really hit them between 1 and 4 damage. However, it was at least a successful strike, thanks to me overwhelming their armor. Advantages and disadvantages can also play a key role in really how your attacks hit, whether they will or won't, the key factor. Here you can see an enemy, 2 of them, both drunk and asleep. One inside of my effective range, 88% chance to hit them, and one just outside of it, in this case only a 75% chance to hit. And you can see the advantage or disadvantage effects happening right up the top, sleeping and target outside normal range, 2 cancelling each other out. Now in practice, an advantaged roll, like this one here, and now this one here that I've changed my range, should give you a really high chance to hit because you're rolling 2 dice instead of 1. You're combating 2 dice against their 1. The game will take the higher score when you have the advantage. So it's a much better idea to attack with advantage. Of course, other factors like the opponent's armor class will be having an impact here, and I could look to get high ground, move through the shadows, and do other things to lift up my advantaged roll. Enemies who are prone, who are impacted by spells or grease, who don't see you lurking in the shadows, or who are interestingly surprised, causing them to skip their first turn, will be at various disadvantages in combat. When the game is specifically referring to that advantage like I have here, thanks to a weapon enchantment and that I'm hiding, it's referring to the fact that I'm rolling an additional attack dice. Again, just to reiterate, that greatly increases my chances of actually hitting the enemy. Once the strike goes through, I'm almost guaranteed to deal damage then. You should also take advantage of the environment. So many things are collapsible, like bridges to knock your enemies down and force them prone. Of course, grease and fire traps are ever popular, and you could even take down their war drum to stop them bringing in reinforcements. A quick note on saving throws. These can take place at all sorts of times, like when you take a special attack against an enemy that may have an additional effect, like causing them to drop their weapon. Many spells fall under this category, as well as they have extra kinds of additional effects, or as you're literally navigating around the world, you'll notice these throws too, like moving through difficult terrain or getting caught in a web. you're constantly rolling the die or rolling the dice to try and save yourself from extra effects that are taking place. These saving throws generally leverage your skills and proficiencies, so it might be a dexterity saving roll that saves you from something that requires you to do a bit of a dip and a dive, for example. Saving throws are really important. They'll mitigate potentially spell damage, maybe half of it, save you from nasty effects. So it's important to keep in mind that all of these rolls are happening basically automatically and all of the time. And finally, let's talk about reviving our fallen friends, hopefully not fallen foes. When a teammate, a character, goes down like this during battle, they will themselves roll to try and pick themselves up or fail, and that's indicated by these two bars, one reaching around and up to the left and the other moving down to the right towards a skull. Every time they roll, they'll increase that bar, either the progress bar towards the star, yay, they'll get back up, or down toward the skull. This character has one towards each of them, so they'll keep rolling on their turns until they hopefully, as demonstrated by this one in the top left, save themselves by getting 3 successful save rolls before 3 failures. We can of course help a character up at any time, this character quite close to perishing, so I'll pick them up first, and thankfully my wonderful sorcerer has actually successfully saved themselves in that case. You can use the help action, but keep in mind that you'll be lifting them up on 1 hit point, so a little bit of strategy here. You might want to pick up someone whose turn it is next, so that they can heal themselves, or of course pick up the person who's at the greatest threat of literally dying, not just falling down. In this case, that's what I'm going to do here because they have 1 failed roll already. You can, of course, also revive from a distance using a variety of spells and healing abilities to lift a character up, and when you do that, you'll be reviving them on a little bit of health too. So it can be a good idea instead of trying to use the help action, especially if you're in a bit of a desperate situation, you're trying to pick lots of people up, they're down over here, they're down over there, you just can't revive them and actually have them stay alive long enough to carry out a strike. You could also use a scroll to pick them back up, and don't worry, without any spoilers, you can revive a character who has fully died inside or outside of combat in the story itself. So don't panic too much, but do try and keep them alive. And that concludes today's video, everybody, for my essential beginner's guide for combat in Baldur's Gate 3. I hope this carried you through, ideally taught you something new. If it did, show me some love below, and I'll see you all next time. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.